Ich bedanke mich recht herzlich für die Einladung und für diese Gelegenheit, zur Ehre von Otto Muck hier anwesend zu sein und meinen Beitrag zu leisten, auch aus Dankbarkeit für das, was ich bei ihm gelernt habe und weiterhin lerne. Ich bitte um Verständnis und Geduld, wenn ich jetzt weiter auf Englisch vortrage. Pope Francis has a very different style of writing and speaking and indeed acting in comparison with his predecessors. He had not been a professor of philosophy as had been Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, nor had he been a professor of theology as was Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. Francis had been a pastor as archbishop and a religious superior as rector of a college and a provincial superior in Argentina. This is not intended to call into question the profundity and validity of his messages. His rootedness in a strand of theological reflection related to liberation theology, the theology of the people, has been shown to be very rich and very challenging. Still, it remains that we do not expect an academic style of writing in Pope Francis's letters and exhortations. What a surprise then to find in his recent letter, Laudato Si, with a very practical concern for our common home, that he seems to invoke a profound metaphysical principle, namely, that everything that is, insofar as it is good. This principle, recognizable as recalling the transcendentals of St. Thomas Aquinas, is not further explained. Those familiar with Thomist philosophy will recognize the topic, elaborated in the Disputed Questions on Truth, as in other texts from Aquinas. So what is this excursion into metaphysics? Does the Pope want us, that is, all of us who are concerned about climate change and degradation of our environment, the vulnerability of our common home, does he want us to return to philosophy? I would not be against that. Certainly, some philosophical competence is required to engage with an interpretation and reconstruction of Thomas, and in consequence, further work of a philosophical nature is needed to understand what Pope Francis is saying. And so for help with this project, I turn to Professor Otto Muck, my Dr. Vater, as you've been told, who shows how philosophy can be of service in facilitating dialogue, conversations between representatives of different disciplines and different positions. And I want to turn then also to the work of another philosopher who provides us with a possible line of argument to extend what I will open up here, an American, Scott Davison, who addresses the relevant notion of intrinsic goodness. Accordingly, there are 4 parts to my presentation this evening, and you have in the handout, I hope, the summary of the presentation, which might help to follow the ins and outs of this discussion. So as I said, I am very honored to be invited to give this Aquinas lecture in the context of honoring Otto Muck on his 90th birthday. As is fitting to the occasion, I begin with his work on the analysis of dialogue between worldviews. In second place, I consider Pope Francis's use of metaphysics in his letter on care for our common home. And since St. Thomas must be mentioned in the Aquinas lecture, my third section expounds briefly his effort to make sense of the principle of goodness. The challenge we philosophers face in our world today is that our philosophical tools can be as much in need of interpretation and reconstruction as the ancient and inherited worldviews with which we deal. It's not enough to rely on Thomas to explain Francis. The challenge is to make sense of what they say in terms that our contemporaries can access and understand. The fourth section explores one possible path. Now, at the beginning, I should explain or clarify one possible misunderstanding. Our language is always fluid and ambiguous. When my title refers to the priority of being good, you might be tempted to interpret this in moral terms, as in being a good person, well-behaved, law-abiding, auf Deutsch, brav. Nein, my focus is not so narrow. The longer title is the priority of being good over being useful. The goodness of all that is my focus. And that includes, but is much broader than, the goodness of morally capable beings who succeed in living well. The focus then is more metaphysical than ethical. But the metaphysical must include the ethical also. In giving an account of what is, we have to say something about the implications of our convictions for the practical, for the conduct of our lives, for our actions. And so my first section ought to look on the analysis of dialogue between worldviews. Otto's work on the structure of dialogue between worldviews, and specifically between religious worldviews, has proved very useful, and it has greatly influenced my work in political philosophy. Of particular importance is his discussion of the 4 criteria operative in the process of correction as an expressed worldview adapts and develops. These criteria provide the measure of adequacy for a worldview to perform its function of enabling its holder, whether an individual or a group, to orient themselves in their environment, relying on a set of convictions or commitments. But I want to focus on a different element of Muck's analysis of the logical structure of worldviews and the dialogue between them in this paper. I draw attention to what he suggests is required in the key steps of interpreting a worldview. This requires identification and elaboration of the engendering experiences, images, and convictions that make up the core of a worldview. What is encountered in life, experience in the widest sense, is represented symbolically in a worldview in such a manner that it is interpreted and its practical relevance is indicated. For the interpretation and for the direction towards action, a worldview relies on a set of images and concepts as well as general sentences that are taken for granted, but which allow the spontaneous interpretation of experience to appear justified and valid. People with differing worldviews may find that their generative experiences are sufficiently similar or overlap to such an extent that they share key ideas and principles. But it can also happen that mutual understanding is blocked by real differences in interpretation or appreciation and evaluation because of a lack of a shared horizon. In such a case, additional work of reconstruction is required to enable a dialogue to take place. Then it is necessary to focus on the elements comprising the content of the worldview. Professor Muck suggests that we attend to those generative experiences that provide a model for the interpretation of other experiences, and which may be generalized into statements that are then applied across the full range of events. A worldview has the function of helping people to orient themselves in their environment, to make sense of it, and to direct their actions. And so its function is integrative. And that it provides a different kind of explanation than we would usually find in the empirical sciences, which is predictive. And that's a very important distinction that is made between an integrative and a predictive explanation. The theoretical and the practical functions of a worldview are also distinguished, but not separated, because they are seen in their interconnectedness within the whole. In what follows, I will return to some of these points: the usefulness of Muck's identification of generative experiences as providing models, and the generalization into principles forming the basis of worldviews will be illustrated in the following sections. So now I go to my second section. Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter, Laudato Si', as we know, enters into a heated debate in our world. We are familiar with the appeal he makes to everyone to care for our common home. An aspect of the letter we may overlook in our concentration on the central message is what he has to say about the quality of debate about the issue of climate change. To what extent human agency is causally responsible for the emerging threat to the planet must be treated seriously, given that the living conditions of very many poor people throughout the world are seriously at risk. But Pope Francis bemoans the poor quality of the resulting debate. Sectional interest groups manage to dominate in some respects, blocking consideration of important matters and diverting attention to irrelevancies. Similarly, he points out how many people directly affected by the issues are excluded and denied the opportunity of contributing from their standpoint. The quality of listening, of attending to what is said, leaves much to be desired in his view. And I quote from his letter, just to remind you of how he takes issue with the quality of dialogue, of debate. It's remarkable, he writes, how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. There are too many special interests, and economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. The alliance between the economy and technology ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. Consequently, the most one can expect is superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern for the environment, whereas any genuine attempts by groups within society to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions or an obstacle to be circumvented. So like Professor Muck, Pope Francis has a concern for a certain quality of dialogue. And while he doesn't use the language of worldviews, it is evident that the matters at issue are of such a nature that they guide one's whole orientation to reality. However, Francis is not simply a commentator on the dialogue and on the conduct of the relevant debates. He also enters directly into the conversation and presents his own point of view. I want to focus on a key element of his position, of his worldview, as we might say, and relying on Professor Muck's toolkit for the analysis of dialogue between worldviews, I want to investigate and reconstruct that core element in such a way that it might be more intelligible and ultimately more accessible to those to whom the letter is addressed. The core element is indicated already in the title of my talk, the priority of being good over being useful. Pope Francis highlights what he considers a regrettable attitude prevalent in our world. This is the attitude towards created reality, even towards people, that regards what exists solely through the lens of what might be made useful for one or other human purpose. The practical attitude of using what is available to feed ourselves, to shelter ourselves, and to build a convenient environment is so central to our human experience that we cannot imagine being without this practical orientation. The ingenuity to recognize what might be done with stone and wood, with clay and wattle and straw, has been a central element in ensuring the survival of humankind in our diverse situations and cultures. The Inuit of Greenland and Canada found ways of using ice blocks to build shelters. The Great Plains natives of North America found ways of using animal hides for their shelters. Shingle roofs in Tyrolean valleys, thatched straw roofs in Ireland show the ingenuity and creativity of humans who have seen the potential of material resources to be put to use for human purposes. And we could go on listing examples, as you know. Surely the Pope is not suggesting that there is something wrong with this attitude. What he seems to be concerned about is the predominance of that attitude, so that it becomes a paradigm, a pattern, or in Muck's terms, a model for all encounter with created reality. This is a model arising from a generative experience, then generalized into an attitude and even a principle. Francis calls it the Technocratic Paradigm. Its predominance results in the neglect of other perspectives that are not so much concerned with the use to be made of things as much as with the appreciation of and wonder at those things. It marginalizes a perspective that glories in what is and delights in it, and not only values what is useful. Pope Francis cites the German bishops, along with the Catechism of the Church, to underline the point. And I quote, he's quoting from a declaration of the German Bishops' Conference of 1980 on Fragen der Umwelt und der Energieversorgung. The German bishops have taught that where other creatures are concerned, we can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. The Catechism clearly and forcefully criticizes a distorted anthropocentrism, he writes, and quotes, "Each creature possesses its own particular goodness and perfection. Each of the various creatures, willed in its own being, reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. Man must therefore respect the particular goodness of every creature to avoid any disordered use of things." It's noticeable that there are two distinguishable but related ideas in these statements quoted from the two sources. The bishops formulate what is, on the face of it, a philosophical premise, the priority of being over being useful. The Catechism, as we've seen, makes a similar statement. Each creature possesses its own particular goodness. But the Catechism goes further and invokes a theological premise to explain it. The goodness of things derives from being willed by God, reflecting God's wisdom and goodness. The quoted passage from the Catechism draws a moral conclusion, pointing to the duty to respect the goodness and avoid the misuse of things. Is it possible, and this is my question, is it possible to interpret and explicate the core idea here in purely secular or philosophical terms? After all, Pope Francis is addressing all inhabitants of our common home and attempting to motivate care for the common home. So it is his intention and hope that the arguments he presents will be accessible and intelligible to fellow human beings, regardless of their faith commitments or lack of them. In the spirit of Professor Muck's work dedicated to facilitating reasoned dialogue between representatives of worldviews, I pursue this task of explicating the central idea in philosophical terms. And now I turn to my third section, Thomas Aquinas, because of course there is already a rich philosophical tradition of reflection on the idea of the goodness of every being, regardless of its uselessness or usefulness. This is the third strand in my paper, acknowledging the context of our gathering for the Aquinas lecture, marking his feast day on the 28th of January. The Transcendentals of St. Thomas Aquinas announce the metaphysical properties of beings. Whatever is, has being, is one, is true, and is good. The disputed questions on truth provide us with the relevant texts as well as related passages in the different summae. No doubt, this is the inherited wisdom invoked by Pope Francis in the encyclical, but it is not sufficiently familiar to provide the necessary elaboration for the Pope's thought. In fact, the medieval worldview articulated by St. Thomas is as much in need of mediation and explication as the Pope's own words. In accepting and repeating the doctrine of the Transcendentals, Aquinas affirms that everything, insofar as it is good. He presents the list of transcendental concepts in various texts, sometimes expanding from the usual four, being, one, true, good, to include thing and something. The Transcendentals are not understood as additions to being, the first comprehension of the intellect, that which is first intended in our knowing. nor are they deduced from the concept of being. They are conceptual additions recognized as belonging together with the concept of a being. The notion of one belongs with being, since a being is one thing and not another, both indivisible in itself and separable from any other thing. The notions of true and good identify relations. True specifying the relation to intellect, insofar as what is can be the object of curiosity and investigation in the pursuit of knowledge of what is. And then good, specifying the relation of any being to appetite, understood as tendency towards possession of and rest in the thing. Aquinas makes much use of Aristotle's account of the good as what all things desire. As he frequently repeats, it is of the nature of the good to be an end, the goal of tendency and of appetite. There is a degree of complexity here. Two affirmations are made. First, that all things are good, and second, that all things seek the good. The latter expresses the fact that everything tends to its own fulfillment, its own completion in the full realization of its potential. The former expresses the fact that each single thing potentially can be desired, either as a means to the good, the completion or perfection of the desiring being, or as an end, that it be completed for its own sake. And so there's a question here for Francis's purposes, if he is relying on Thomas Aquinas, if he understands good in relationship to appetite and will, does that prejudice the way in which people conceive of the goodness of things, namely in relation to human interests and human well-being? Is there a bias in relying on a metaphysics of act and action? Aquinas, following Aristotle, wants to generalize the notion of act such that being is comprehended as act. And even the inanimate being is in act insofar as it is. But the primary source of analogy for action is deliberate human action, in which the notions of end and appetite find their core meaning. When the transcendental good is affirmed of any being, it is recognized as potentially an end of action by analogy with the way a deliberately chosen goal is an end of action, an end of human action. The role of analogy in the language can fade from consciousness, with the result that the value of all things is identified in relation to human interest, and in particular, humans' interests in achieving their own ends, which might even include the end of satisfaction of the desire to know. To use the language of the transcendentals to explain or elaborate what Pope Francis wants to say with his invocation of this metaphysical principle that everything that is, insofar as it is good, I suggest is risky. Pope Francis wants to distinguish different attitudes to things. The attitude that regards the potential usefulness of things to see how they might be exploited for human benefit, and the attitude that regards things as valuable in their own right, regardless of their usefulness to humans. And he wants to say further that the goodness of being is prior to the goodness of being useful. Aquinas' account of good as a transcendental is risky because the notion of good at stake is explained in terms of relation to appetite, and the notion of end of action is similarly explained by analogy with human action for an end. The danger is that our contemporary audience would not be able to understand the Pope's point, to consider goodness apart from the relation to human appetite and human interests, because the analogical language to explain the point remains tied to these basic realities. Another possible difficulty arises from the centrality of participation as part of St. Thomas's approach to good and goods. Given the identification of being with one, true, and good, The relationship between uncreated being, truth, and goodness with created being, truth, and goodness is explained in terms of participation. This is an important concept in many respects for Aquinas' thought, whether explaining the relationship between God, creator, and the creature, or on the other hand, when specifying what the notion of God must include, as for instance in the clarification offered by the famous 5 ways of Aquinas. For the purposes of explaining how every created thing is good, and understanding good as the end of an appetite or tendency, Aquinas invokes the Creator, who has directed each thing, whether inanimate or animate, to its proper end. His image is the arrow flying to its target because sent on that trajectory by the archer. This is an image he uses in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. The Creator God is the source of that nature in each kind of thing that has directed it to its proper end. The conception of tendency as willed is part of the application of the transcendental notion of good to inanimate things, as well as to animate things that engage consciously with their environment, but ultimately it is the divine will that is invoked. Reliance on this approach for Francis's purposes in Laudato Si is again risky. He addresses his comments to all who live together in our common home and who share in its benefits, but face the same threats to its existence. He appeals to all to change their attitudes and on that basis to change their behavior. But if his argument relies on theological premises, or if his explanation invokes the Creator and the Creator's will, there is the familiar danger that his words and appeal will be dismissed as merely theological, addressed only to those who share the basic presuppositions and the language. For an encounter between worldviews, we must pay attention to such moments when there is no longer a common domain of shared experiences and agreed principles, and we have to seek paths to facilitate mutual understanding so that the dialogue can proceed. And that may require exploring alternative generative experiences or developing other formulations to overcome the incompatibilities in comprehension. And I am suggesting that Aquinas' language here on the good as a transcendental presents us with such a moment, and so we are challenged to seek another approach. Is there another language available that could facilitate this insight more easily? And so I turn to my 4th section, where I look to see if there might be another pathway. The notion of intrinsic value might help us make sense of the Pope's and St. Thomas's words and make them more accessible to our contemporaries concerned about environmental degradation. This notion is proposed and analysed by Scott Davison in a book entitled On the Intrinsic Value of Everything. This appeared in 2012, so it's relatively recent. Davison is a professor of philosophy in Kentucky, United States, but he has also worked in China. And the Asian exposure is reflected in his awareness in the book of the narrowness of many Western perspectives. He wants to defend a thesis, a challenging thesis, that every concrete particular thing that exists is intrinsically valuable to some degree. He is aware of the oddity of this position, given the predominance of human interests in most attempts to determine what is good. From the beginning of his work, he admits that the truth conveyed by this proposition might well be more effectively communicated by poetic or aesthetic media, but there is also the challenge of making it intelligible, and for that, philosophical analysis can help. The strategy of his argument is to begin with the premise that some concrete particular thing is intrinsically valuable to some degree. And he argues from that to his conclusion that all things are intrinsically valuable to some degree, by means of what he calls persuasive elaboration, following a suggestion by Gary Gutting. He is modest about what he claims. He acknowledges that there is no non-circular way of establishing the intrinsic goodness of anything. And he also acknowledges that his conclusion is not arrived at by deduction from the premises. Davison appeals to a common experience which he expects his readers to recognize, of encountering something that has value in itself. The example to which he frequently refers and returns is his children, one of his children. At various ages and stages of development, he experiences them as possessing goodness intrinsically. Now, what is this intrinsic goodness? Intrinsic value is contrasted with other types of value. For want of a better example, my pen has instrumental value because it is useful for writing and signing checks and other documents. But it might also have sentimental value because it's associated with particular memories or is a gift from a special friend. It has monetary or economic value, actually not much of a resale value, but it certainly has what they call replacement cost, should I lose it and have to buy another one. But these instances of value, instrumental, sentimental, and monetary, they are all values that are formulated or understood in relation to a valuing subject. These instances of value rely on a relation to a subject, someone who has reason to value the pen. Without that relational aspect, the type of value in question would disappear. But in the case of intrinsic value, the goodness of the object is recognized or discovered as inherent in the object itself, in its intrinsic structure, regardless of relations to valuing subjects. Part of what it is to be a good person, he writes, is to value the right things in the right ways and for the right reasons. And that presupposes being able to distinguish the different kinds of value that things might possess, and to be appropriately responsive to the value that one encounters in one's life. He cites Augustine's remark about how one's perception can be distorted by agreeable habit, custom, or convention. And he applies that to the tendency in our Western culture to regard everything, and sometimes even other people, as at our disposal, to be used for our purposes. The intrinsic value of a thing is a reason for treating it with respect. He suggests that people from other cultures, Asian cultures, for example, may more easily recognize intrinsic value in mundane things and ordinary things and respect them, while, I quote, "Those of us who have been taught since childhood that nearly everything we encounter in everyday life is value neutral may have a more difficult time in recognizing intrinsic value in things." Philosophically, Davison presents his concept of intrinsic value by relying on a number of distinctions in the literature. One is borrowed from the Kantian scholar Christine Korsgaard, who in 1983 draws attention to the common confusion of two distinctions, that between intrinsic and extrinsic goodness, and that between a being sought for its own sake and a thing sought for the sake of something else. Something is intrinsically good if and only if it is good in itself, whereas something is extrinsically good if and only if it receives goodness from another source. That's the first distinction, focusing on the source of goodness. Is it from within or from without? The second distinction is drawn in terms of ends and means. What is sought for its own sake is an end, or final good, while what is sought for the sake of something else is an instrumental good. The point is that these two distinctions become interwoven when people define the intrinsically good as that which is sought for its own sake. And that is a confusion, he suggests. Davison concentrates on intrinsic goodness, not on whether things are sought for their own sake, or for the sake of something else. In other words, he wants to develop a notion of intrinsic value that is not tied from the beginning to being willed by a subject. A second relevant distinction is that between something being valued and something being desired. He borrows this distinction from Gary Watson, based on the observation that there is a difference between valuing something and desiring it, since a person can desire something without valuing it. Adopting both these distinctions from Korsgaard and Watson, Davison rejects the common view that for something to be intrinsically valuable is for it to be desired for its own sake. For him, for something to be intrinsically valuable is for it to be good in itself, irrespective of its relations to other things, such as valuers or desiring subjects. This meaning of good, good in itself, is different from other uses, such as good for some usage or other, or for someone, or good as a specimen of its kind. Having clarified the meaning of good in itself, Davison then considers the ground or source of intrinsic value. He rejects subjectivism about value, the view that the source of all value lies in valuers, in their attitudes, preferences, and so on. Valuing something is an experience of responding to a feature of the world that is independent of one's valuing experience. What are those features of things in the world that warrant a valuing response? Davison proposes the intrinsic structure of a thing is the set of properties that it possesses intrinsically. These are the properties that would be replicated in a perfect copy, even though many other non-intrinsic relative properties could not be replicated. You can't replicate the original because the copy is not the original. He is careful to add, however, that intrinsic properties need not be essential properties. The specific degree of intrinsic value of a thing need not be an essential property of it. As an example, he points to his son, who is more intrinsically valuable, he believes, at 8 years of age than he was as a newborn. There has been no change in the essence, but significant intrinsic properties have developed and have changed. With such disclosure experiences as the recognition of the intrinsic value of a child, Davison proceeds to ask if there are any objects without intrinsic value. Does it belong only to a select group of objects, as for instance human persons? Or is it to be found across a wide spectrum of entities? He wants to defend the thesis that everything has intrinsic value in some degree. The main opponents of his position are of two kinds. First, those who maintain that the notion of intrinsic value is meaningless because it is not possible to provide a criterion to distinguish those things that are intrinsically valuable from those that are value neutral. This he interprets as holding complete intrinsic value neutrality. The second group of opponents are those who claim that intrinsic value is an all or nothing affair, either negating intrinsic value in every case or seeing it as something, if possessed, then always in its fullness. These are understood to defend the possibility of complete intrinsic value saturation. It's all or nothing. Against those who deny that there is any such thing as intrinsic value, he points again to the disclosure experience as exemplified in his discovery of the goodness of his children. But he does admit there is no non-circular way of establishing the reality of intrinsic value. Against those who argue that if there is intrinsic value, then it must be maximally present wherever it occurs, he maintains that intrinsic value admits of degrees, corresponding to the intrinsic structures of things. This argument has to be filled out with considerations from other lines of argument in his book. For instance, to substantiate his assertion of intrinsic value, Davison invites the reader to enter a thought experiment. We are invited to imagine a machine that is capable of annihilating objects by the touch of a button. Were objects placed in this machine, they could be completely eradicated. In such an event of the annihilation of some object, would the world be diminished? not simply in terms of the number of objects it contained, but in terms of the amount of value it possessed. If the object in question had neither instrumental nor sentimental nor market value, could its elimination nonetheless be felt as a loss? With a child, certainly the answer seems evident, but also in varying degrees, Davison expects to have the agreement of readers that other entities will be found to have some measure of intrinsic value. And he proposes that, because he is appealing to what readers will agree to, but he proposes that a fully informed, properly functioning valuer would surely regard the machine's annihilation of one of my children as the loss of something valuable for its own sake. This line of argument is supported by a further consideration which he names as the cutoff question. If something is deemed to possess intrinsic value, where is the line to be drawn to distinguish it from other entities that are value neutral, if there be such? If a child is intrinsically valuable, what about a chimpanzee that seems to be able to do much that is similar to what the child can do? Davison suggests that it is impossible coherently to identify a cutoff line which leaves some entities on one side as having intrinsic goodness and other entities on the other side as without intrinsic value. The same difficulty recurs with the range of objects from trees and vegetation to crystals and stones and machines. The alleged impossibility of a cutoff point is invoked as an argument in favor of the conclusion that everything has intrinsic value to some degree. Two aspects of his argument are particularly significant for his conclusion. One is this demonstration of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of answering the cutoff question. If something is intrinsically valuable, it turns out to be very difficult to demonstrate that other things, like the first in some respects, are not also intrinsically valuable. The second aspect is then critical. The affirmation of intrinsic value in things does not entail that all things are equally valuable. Hence the acknowledgement that there are degrees of intrinsic value. Intrinsic value invokes the response of respect. But this is an overridable demand. Other considerations may warrant disregarding intrinsic value. For instance, the mosquito that annoys me in the night has very negative instrumental value, strong instrumental disvalue, one might say. And that may allow me to disregard the intrinsic value it has from its wonderful intrinsic structure and its capacity to draw blood and communicate malaria without me feeling it at all. A critical review of Davison in the journal Ethics praises the effort to establish the intrinsic goodness of everything, but challenges the reliance of the argument on intuition. So these disclosure experiences, the recognition that he falls back on again and again, that there are some things we can identify in our experience, they are intrinsically good. For instance, the reviewer reports arriving at different conclusions from implementing the thought experiment of the annihilation machine, and suggests that the intuitions on which Davison relies will not be shared by everyone. In fact, a key step in the argument seems to be the anything is better than nothing argument. Is Theresa May making that argument at present in London? Some deal is better than no deal. Anything is better than nothing. But this is not a compelling argument. While it might not be easy to specify the cutoff point between things that are intrinsically valuable and things that lack intrinsic value, a grain of dust, for instance, because it might not be easy to establish this cutoff point, it does not follow that there is no such cutoff point, no dividing line. Nevertheless, the reviewer is sympathetic to the understanding of intrinsic value as the value a thing possesses, independently of how it is related to other things, and specifically related to valuers. And this strikes me as the main strength of Davison's approach for meeting the challenge that Pope Francis's use of the metaphysical principle poses to us. And so I conclude my paper, if not necessarily the argument, because I am simply suggesting a pathway forward for exploring this question. So I suggest that this philosophical analysis could assist in the interpretation and elaboration of Pope Francis's argument in Laudato Si. It takes seriously the assertion that everything that is good. It provides an account of how every single thing is a bearer of intrinsic value, and that it requires of human subjects an attitude of respect. It seems to have some advantages over Aquinas' account in grounding value in the intrinsic structure of things themselves, and distinguishing this grounding from those subjective forms of valuing that link valued things to the valuing activity of valuing persons, or valuers. And it seems to provide a more immediate access to the notion of intrinsic value by invoking key disclosure experiences. Also, as Davison points out in Chapter 7, his analysis is open to a theist elaboration, but at least in its basic terms, it is philosophical and not theological, as the Thomist account inevitably is. Hence, it may be more useful for a wider constituency of those who share the common home and are invited to respect it. The advantage of Davison's approach in comparison with that of Aquinas is that it allows us to speak of the intrinsic value of things without adverting to their relatedness to other things, including valuing subjects. As we have seen, St. Thomas explains goodness by relating things as ends to appetite, will, either that of human agents or that of the Creator. And for the purpose of his letter, Laudato Si, Pope Francis wants to contrast two attitudes, highlighting that of seeing and respecting the good in everything, regardless of its usefulness for our purposes, and to privilege that over the exploitative attitude. However, in making a logical connection between intrinsically valuable and the valuing activities of fully informed, properly functioning valuers, something is, and this is what Davison says, something is intrinsically valuable or good in itself if and only if it would be valued for its own sake by fully informed, properly functioning valuers. Davison ultimately is unable to avoid the relation postulated by Aquinas between goodness and appetite. To this extent, we find the Thomist metaphysics endorsed by his analytic discussion. However, the use of a heuristic notion of the valuer, fully informed, properly functioning, I suggest would allow people without faith, non-believers, to follow and perhaps accept the argument. This hypothetical valuer could be another way, from our point of view, of referring to the Creator, but being more philosophical than a theological treatment, it may better suit Pope Francis's purposes. Finally, I trust that this exploration illustrates the usefulness of Otto Muck's analysis of dialogue between worldviews. My discussion has been an attempt at the ongoing service that philosophical analysis can provide to theology and to the work of evangelization, in this case, the teaching of Pope Francis about care for our common home. In his life and work as a Jesuit philosopher, Professor Otto Muck has provided that service to the Church in an exemplary way, rigorous, but always respectful and courteous. It is an honor and pleasure to be asked to celebrate his 90th birthday in this way. I thank you for your patience. So, Otto, gratuliere.
Ja, schön.